The silence that greeted me beyond that heavy, iron-banded door was not the comforting hush of a forgotten crypt, nor the echoing solemnity of sacred ground. No, this was a profound, suffocating void, a silence that felt ancient and absolute, as if sound itself had been banished from this space eons ago. The air, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something acrid, metallic, like old blood mixed with ozone, clung to my lungs. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat against the overwhelming stillness. I told myself it was just the thrill of transgression, the heady rush of stepping where I was explicitly forbidden. A rationalization, a lie. Even then, a cold dread had begun to seep into my bones, a premonition that whispered of irreversible change. I should have listened. I should have slammed that door shut and turned my back on the yawning darkness. But curiosity, that most insidious of human vices, held me captive, urging me forward into the gloom. My small, battery-operated lantern, clutched tight in a trembling hand, cast a pathetic, dancing circle of light, struggling against the oppressive blackness. This was no simple storage room, no antechamber to a forgotten crypt. The space opened into a vast, cavernous gallery, stretching further than my beam could reach, its ceiling lost somewhere in the inky abyss above. The walls were not rough-hewn stone, but impossibly smooth, obsidian-like panels, broken only by alcoves housing grotesque, faceless statues carved from a dark, porous material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They stood sentinel, frozen in poses of distorted anguish or supplication, their blank faces tilted ever so slightly towards the center of the room, towards me. Or perhaps towards something else, something unseen that occupied the heart of this forsaken place. The floor was paved with a mosaic of intricate, alien symbols, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe at the periphery of my vision, challenging the very geometry of the space. My theological training, my years immersed in the esoteric lore of the Church, offered no explanation for what I beheld. This was not merely pre-Christian. It felt anti-creation, a blasphemy etched into the very fabric of existence. As I ventured further, each step sending a faint echo into the boundless silence, my lantern beam eventually settled upon a series of alcoves lining the curved walls. They were not for statuary here, but for shelves, ancient and warped, laden with books. Thousands of them. Not the vellum-bound folios of canonical texts, nor the illuminated manuscripts of monastic orders. These were different. Their bindings were of unknown leathers, some scaly and iridescent, others rough and fibrous like desiccated flesh. Many were secured with heavy iron clasps, corroded chains, or strange, intricate locks fashioned from brass and bone. The air grew heavier here, thick with the scent of aged paper and something else. A faint, lingering perfume of decay, of forgotten secrets exhaling their slow, toxic breath. I ran a gloved hand over one spine, tracing symbols I recognized from no known alphabet, glyphs that seemed to vibrate with a latent energy, a silent hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. This was not the Vatican's secret archives, a repository of historical heresies. This was a library of the utterly forbidden, a chronicle of truths too terrible for human comprehension, secreted away not just from the world, but from God himself. Then I saw it. Resting on a solitary pedestal in the center of the largest alcove, separated from the other volumes, was the book. It lay open, its pages a deep, bruised crimson, unmarred by dust, as if someone had just finished reading it. The binding was unlike any other, a dark, leathery skin stretched taut over a frame that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. I convinced myself it was a trick of the eye, a fatigue-induced hallucination. Its title, if it had one, was inscribed in a script I instinctively understood to be a corruption of ancient Aramaic, mingled with characters drawn from some primordial, pre-human source. Lexicon Tenebrarum, the Dictionary of Shadows. Even the mental translation sent a shiver of ice through my veins. I should have turned away. I should have recognized the immediate, soul-deep revulsion as a warning. But it called to me, a siren song sung not to my ears, but directly to the deepest, most desperate part of my intellect, promising answers to questions I didn't even know I possessed. My fingers, numb and clumsy, reached out, hovering over the pages. The moment my fingertips brushed the blood-red parchment, a faint hum resonated through the gallery, a tremor that seemed to originate from the very stone beneath my feet. The pages were impossibly thin, yet resilient, covered in dense, meticulously hand-scribed text. And illustrations. Oh, the illustrations. They were not mere drawings, but intricate, three-dimensional diagrams of cosmic geometries that defied Euclidean space, of entities that shifted and writhed even on the static page, their forms suggesting unthinkable anatomies and unimaginable scales. The script, a grotesque symphony of twisted Hebrew and archaic Latin, began to resolve into meaning as I stared. My eyes, refusing to obey my terrified brain, scanned the passages. There were names, not names of saints or prophets, but of primordial intelligences, entities existing beyond the veil of our reality, each accompanied by a precise phonetic pronunciation guide, a careful instruction on how to utter them, how to give them form in the temporal world. I kept reading, my breath catching in my throat, a knot of pure terror tightening in my stomach. The text spoke of forgotten rites, of blasphemous conjunctions, of the thin places where dimensions overlapped, and the very fabric of existence could be torn asunder. It described rituals to pierce the veil, to glimpse the outer dark, to call forth beings from the yawning void beyond the stars. The narratives were not allegories or fables. They were historical accounts, chillingly precise, detailing instances where these conjurations had been attempted, the catastrophic results, the unraveling of minds, the very collapse of civilizations. There were diagrams of sigils, incredibly complex and alien, that hummed with a palpable power, radiating an invisible force that prickled my skin and made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I read of the silent litany, a specific sequence of thoughts, not sounds, that could resonate with these entities, a method of communion that bypassed the need for vocalization, making the rituals far more insidious, utterly undetectable. Vaticani Obscura. The Church, or at least a hidden faction within it, had clearly known about these forces, had perhaps even been charged with their suppression. But this book, this was not a warning. It was an instruction manual, a syllabus for cosmic damnation. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the meticulously documented blasphemies with everything I believed, everything I knew about the world. It was a lie, all of it. The orderly universe, the benevolent God, the comforting structures of faith, all a thin veneer over an abyss teeming with unspeakable things. I should have stopped when the faint, high-pitched ringing started in my ears, a sound that seemed to emanate not from without, but from deep within my own skull. I should have stopped when the shadows in the periphery of my vision began to coalesce into indistinct, watching shapes. But I kept reading, compelled, ensnared by the horror and the intoxicating allure of forbidden knowledge. The book spoke of the inheritors, a lineage of those who had received knowledge directly from the outer dark, who carried the taint of these entities in their very blood. It detailed their characteristics, their subtle marks, their uncanny ability to influence, to subvert, to open the gateways. I thought I was imagining it until I saw a pattern in the archival photographs, a recurring motif in the descriptions of certain historical figures, whispers of abnormalities, of unnatural longevity, of eyes that saw too much. And then the sickening realization. Some of those characteristics, those marks, were eerily familiar. The gallery grew colder, the oppressive silence punctuated by the erratic beat of my own heart. I could feel eyes on me, countless eyes, not just from the faceless statues, but from the darkness itself, from the very air I breathed. The words on the page seemed to burn themselves into my retina, searing indelible brands onto my consciousness. There was no unseeing, no unknowing. This information, this dreadful, blasphemous truth, had become a part of me, grafted onto my soul like a parasitic twin. My rational mind screamed in protest, but the dread had seeped too deep, a cold, unfeeling certainty that had replaced every comfort, every illusion of safety. I was no longer an observer. I was a participant, an initiate, merely by having read. I had stepped into the gallery, and from that moment I belonged to it. It had marked me. And now I am one of the inheritors of its truth. forever bound to the dread secrets it revealed. The air in the scriptoria minor hung heavy and stale, thick with the scent of aged parchment, beeswax, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like ancient, dried blood. I was deep within its labyrinthine confines, a forgotten annex of the Vatican Library, a place only whispered about by those few who even knew of its existence. My focus was supposed to be on the palimpsests, the erased and overwritten texts beneath the sanctioned histories, searching for the pre-Nicene fragments I believed held the key to the Viridian doctrine, a purported clandestine liturgy that some apocryphal texts hinted at. But the silence here, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure, was punctuated only by the scritch of my stylus against my notepad and the ceaseless, unnerving presence of the oil paintings that lined every available wall space. Saints and martyrs, angels and virgins, rendered in the faded, opulent styles of the early Renaissance and Byzantine periods, their expressions locked in perpetual agony or beatific serenity. I tried to ignore them. I really did. I traced the faded Latin of a margin note, a commentary on the Book of Azathoth, or so I suspected from the oblique references, my mind buzzing with the thrill of academic discovery. But then a shiver, an internal discord, rattled my concentration. I moved to stretch my legs, to alleviate the cramp that had taken root in my spine from hours bent over the lectern. As I shifted my weight, turning my head to survey the length of the narrow chamber, my gaze inadvertently swept across the painted face of St. Jude Thaddeus. His eyes, fixed on some unseen point of martyrdom in the painting, seemed to follow me. I paused, a slight frown creasing my brow. It was a common optical illusion, I told myself, a trick of perspective designed by master painters to draw the viewer deeper into the scene. Nothing more. I dismissed it, pushing the thought away like a persistent fly. My focus returned to the text, a particularly convoluted passage that seemed to describe not spiritual awakening, but a kind of forced transformation, yet the feeling persisted, a prickling on the back of my neck. I looked up again, this time more deliberately. St. Jude's eyes still held me. I took a step to the left, then another. His painted pupils, dark and deep, shifted imperceptibly with my movement. I moved right, and his gaze tracked, unwavering, unblinking. My heart gave a little lurch. This was not merely an illusion. This was too precise, too sentient. The hairs on my arms stood on end, not from cold, but from something far more primal. And then it happened. I was staring directly into the sorrowful eyes of Mary Magdalene, depicted at the foot of the cross, her face a canvas of grief. I stood utterly still, my breath held captive in my lungs, and I watched as her right eyelid, painted centuries ago, lowered, then slowly, deliberately lifted again. A blink. A slow, languid blink. My knees threatened to buckle. A cold sweat erupted on my skin, chilling me to the bone. It was impossible. It had to be. My mind, overtaxed and exhausted, was playing cruel tricks. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, and opened them again. Magdalene's eyes were wide once more, but now a subtle shift in their depth, a new, almost imperceptible sheen, made them seem wet, alive. I should have run then. My primal instincts screamed at me to bolt, to flee this cursed chamber and never look back. The academic in me, however, the seeker of the forbidden and the unknown, remained paralyzed by a morbid curiosity. This wasn't some dusty fresco in a forgotten chapel. This was a closely guarded secret, a restricted archive within the church's most sacred, most feared repository. What could animate these ancient effigies? Was it some unholy vestige of the Viridian doctrine, an attempt to infuse spiritual essence into the physical realm? Or was it something far older, something tied to the true purpose of this chamber, a purpose I was only just beginning to unravel through the hushed verses of the Liber-Ignes? These weren't just paintings, they were witnesses, perhaps even jailers. But I lingered, rooted to the spot, my gaze sweeping from one portrait to another. St. Catherine of Siena, her head tilted slightly, her eyes, once serene, now held a glint of something akin to pity. St. Sebastian, his body pierced by arrows, his lips, previously sealed in stoic suffering, seemed to tremble, as if on the verge of exhaling. Each set of painted eyes, dozens of them, met mine, tracking my every nervous tremor. They weren't merely observing, they were communicating. A wordless warning, a deep abyssal sorrow, a profound ancient judgment. They had seen so much, known so much, and now they were sharing their burden with me. Or rather, I was forced to shoulder it. My frantic fingers sought my notepad, my stylus, desperate to record this impossible observation, to anchor myself in the scientific, the empirical. But the words wouldn't come. My thoughts were a panicked swarm of buzzing insects. The forbidden texts I had been so assiduously deciphering, those heretical manuscripts describing veiled rites and esoteric names that could, allegedly, awaken the slumbering spirit of the ages, suddenly took on a terrifying new context. Was this what they meant? Was this the consequence of even reading such blasphemous verses? Had my mere proximity, my intellectual curiosity, inadvertently roused something dormant, something meant to remain forever unseen, forever unheard? The paintings were not just watching me. They were watching what I was becoming. I thought I was imagining it until the whispers began, faint as a moth's wingbeat, yet undeniably there, just at the edge of my auditory perception. Not from the paintings themselves, but through them, emanating from the depths of the chamber, from the very walls, from the ancient wood of the lecterns. Names, fragments of ancient tongues, soft as a lover's breath, yet laden with unimaginable power. Ad infinitum, lux aeterna, veridia. My own name, a soft, intimate sigh, seemed to weave itself into the chorus. The eyes of the paintings, now wide and brilliant, pulsed with a subtle internal light. They were alive, more alive than I had ever been. And I, in my arrogant pursuit of knowledge, had opened the door to something that intended to consume not just my understanding, but my very essence. I was no longer an observer. I was now part of their tableau, painted into their eternity of silent, knowing dread. The dust motes dance in their knowing light, and I can never truly leave. The book, that damned tome bound in something indistinguishable from petrified skin, lay open on my desk. Its pages, brittle and smelling of ozone and forgotten crypts, had become my constant companion, a silent, malevolent confessor. I should have stopped when the footnotes began to contradict known historical records, when the Latin shifted from liturgical to something older, darker, riddled with syntax that seemed to writhe on the page. I should have turned away when the index listed names, not of saints or martyrs, but of entities I'd only ever heard whispered in the most apocryphal of Gnostic texts, entities purported to exist beyond the veil, waiting for an invitation. But I kept reading, didn't I? My curiosity, a ravenous beast, gnawing at the tether of my reason. That's the insidious allure of forbidden knowledge. It promises enlightenment, then delivers only a deeper, more profound darkness. The passage I fixated on spoke of a specific observance, a liminal hour when the mundane world briefly aligns with an altogether different reality. It wasn't a ritual in the traditional sense. No incense or elaborate incantations were prescribed, merely a presence, an act of silent witness. The text, in its archaic, unsettling elegance, described the Vesperi Crunti, the bloody Vespers, stating that on certain nights, under a specific celestial conjunction, which chillingly was tonight, the sacred effigies, the painted saints and stoic Madonnas would lament the trespasses committed against the divine fabric. They would weep not tears of water but tears of blood, a sanguine libation marking the hour of truth. I dismissed it, of course, a metaphor, poetic hyperbole. A warning against sacrilege, perhaps. But the details were too specific. The mention of bells tolling midnight and blood steaming upon hallowed stone, echoing with an unsettling exactness that gnawed at the edges of my skepticism. The compulsion was an itch under my skin, a whisper in the deepest recesses of my mind. I thought I was imagining it, a figment of sleep deprivation and academic obsession, until the moon outside my window, a bloated, bruised orb, seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent red. It was a sign, I told myself, a trick of the light, but the ancient calendar in the book, marked with faded astrological sigils, suggested otherwise. Midnight approached, a slow, inevitable crawl of the clock hands. I found myself drawn out, my feet moving of their own accord through the silent, deserted streets. The air was unnaturally still, heavy with an unspoken promise of something momentous, something dreadful. The old cathedral of St. Jude, a Gothic behemoth whose gargles always seemed to sneer at passers-by, was my destination. Its immense bronze bells, rumored to be cast during the time of the Crusades, were famous for their deep, resonant chimes that carried for miles. The gates, usually locked tighter than a confessor's oath after dusk, stood ajar, a silent invitation. Or perhaps a trap. The vast narthex swallowed me whole, the air inside colder, older than the chill night itself. Dust motes danced in the sparse moonlight filtering through the rose window, illuminating the shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the nave. The silence was profound, broken only by the echo of my own frantic heartbeat. My gaze fell upon the row of life-sized statues lining the side aisles. St. Michael, sword poised. St. Catherine, serene even with her wheel, the mournful Madonna cradling an absent child. Their painted eyes, usually fixed in benevolent or solemn contemplation, now seemed to follow me, to pierce through my pretense of scholarly detachment. They knew I felt it, they knew why I was there. My breath hitched in my throat. Every fibre of my being screamed at me to flee, to run back to the false safety of my study, to burn the book, to forget everything. But the dread, a cold, clawing hand at my throat, held me captive. The book had promised a revelation, and I was morbidly, sickeningly obliged to see it through. Then it began. A deep, resonant thrum shook the very foundations of the cathedral, vibrating through my bones. Dong. The first bell tolled, heavy and mournful, its echo lingering in the vast space. And with that first chime, a single, glistening bead of crimson welled in the inner corner of the Madonna's left eye. It trembled, a perfect ruby sphere before slowly, inexorably, tracing a path down her painted cheek. Dong. The second bell, and another tear, this time from St. Jude himself, mirroring the first, slow and deliberate. Dong. A third, and St. Michael, the warrior saint, whose expression was always so resolute, now seemed to weep a single drop of viscous scarlet that clung to his marble cheek like a fresh wound. With each successive chime, more tears flowed, not from all of them at once, but in an agonizing, staggered progression, as if each saint had to individually bear the weight of their sorrow. The silence between the tolls became a crucible, amplifying the wet, sickening sound of drops hitting the polished marble floor. Sizzle. A faint hiss, almost imperceptible over the lingering reverberations of the bells, accompanied each fall. I looked down, my gaze riveted to the floor beneath the Madonna. A small puddle, no larger than a florin, had formed, steaming faintly, an eerie vapor rising into the frigid air, smelling metallic and rich. It was a smell I knew intimately, one that always signified pain or profound injury, the coppery tang of human blood. I tried to shout, to break the awful spell, to voice the terror that choked me, but my vocal cords seized, my voice dissolving into a choked, silent gasp. My mouth was dry, tasting of ash and ozone. My lungs burned, demanding air they couldn't draw. It was as if the sound itself had been siphoned from the world, leaving only the relentless tolling of the bells and the wet, rhythmic drip of crimson. Nobody else came. No sacristan, no night watchman, no wandering tourist. Only me, alone in the vast, echoing tomb, and the bleeding saints, their expressions frozen in silent agony, or perhaps silent condemnation. This was no miracle. This was a violation, a rupture, a grotesque unveiling of something that should have remained eternally hidden. Was it a curse for my trespass, for daring to read what was forbidden, for seeking what was not meant for human eyes? Or was it merely the consequence of an ancient, terrible mechanism, set in motion by the mere fact of my witnessing? The true horror, though, was not just the sight itself, but the smell. The potent, coppery scent of the blood pooling on the marble, steaming in the cold air, was unmistakably familiar. It was the smell of my own blood, the specific metallic tang I'd grown to recognize from countless small cuts and scrapes throughout my life. It was my scent. And as the final, agonizing bell struck midnight, echoing into the sudden, profound silence, I tasted it on my tongue, a phantom taste of iron and salt, and knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that this was just the beginning. The knowledge I now possess is a brand, searing me from within, a constant reminder that I am no longer just an observer, but irrevocably entwined in a tapestry woven with threads of blood and impossible truth. The chill here isn't just the damp stone, it's a profound, seeping cold that emanates from the very heart of the building, a low hum of malevolence that vibrates just beneath the threshold of hearing. It's been weeks since I first stumbled into this forgotten wing, and every day the air grows heavier, thicker with unspoken secrets. I tell myself I came here for academic pursuit, for the thrill of uncovering lost texts, but deep down, I know it's more than that. It's an obsessive hunger, a need to pierce the veil, to touch the forbidden. And now I regret every single step that brought me to this precipice. I remember the dust, a fine, ancient powder that coated everything, thick as snow, each mote an undisturbed testament to decades, perhaps centuries, of absolute stillness. The air was stale, tasting of decay and forgotten leather. I was drawn to a particular section of shelving, a recess almost entirely obscured by a leaning stack of crumbling folios. Behind them, I discerned the dark, unpolished wood of a small, nondescript cabinet. It wasn't opulent, not ornate like the main archival cabinets, but it possessed an unsettling anonymity, as if designed to be overlooked, forgotten. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate dance with brittle pages, traced the contours of its single, locked drawer. The lock was an old, intricate brass mechanism, a relic that spoke of a time when secrets were guarded with more than just a key. For days, I tried various skeletal keys I'd found among the archivist's scattered effects, each one failing to catch. My frustration mounted, yet so did my conviction that this was the place. This was where the true answers lay hidden. Then, one evening, as the last sliver of twilight bled from the high, grimy windows, a small, unmarked iron key, almost hidden among a tangle of rusty paperclips in a ceramic dish, finally clicked into place. The sound echoed in the cavernous silence, a sharp, metallic report that sent a tremor through the oppressive quiet. I pulled the drawer open, slowly, cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, resting alone on a bed of faded velvet, was not a bound book, but a bundle of loose parchment sheets. Their edges were stiff, crinkled, and inexplicably blackened as if scorched by flame, yet not consumed. Several blobs of dark, brittle wax, once perhaps red or black, still clung to various folds, remnants of seals long broken. The script, a meticulous, almost calligraphic hand, was dense and unforgiving, flowing across the aged material with an unnerving precision. This was a journal, undoubtedly, the personal record of the last known archivist of this collection, one brother Alaric Thorne. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. I should have stopped then, closed the drawer, walked away. But the pull was irresistible, the thirst for knowledge, a gnawing, insatiable beast. I carried the parchment to my small, temporary study, the flickering oil lamp casting dancing shadows across the Latin text. Alaric's early entries were academic, detailing the acquisition of rare illuminated manuscripts, the careful cataloguing of forbidden grimoires. He spoke of the Holy See's directives regarding certain apocryphal pictorial works and the necessary containment protocols. My academic curiosity, initially piqued, slowly curdled into a cold dread as his tone began to shift. The meticulous hand grew shakier, the language less formal, more personal, more frantic. He started referring to a specific collection of paintings housed in the adjoining gallery, not by name, but with a growing, palpable fear. Entries grew fragmented, almost poetic in their horror. He described the gallery itself as a liminal space, a nexus where the fabric of reality was thin. Then came the chilling revelation, scrawled across 2 pages, underlined repeatedly as if to scream its importance. The gallery must never be empty at midnight. Nunquam vacuum est ad medium noctem. Someone must always stand as witness. Semper aliquis testis ad stat. Otherwise, the paintings unbind. Aliter picturi solvuntur. My eyes raced over the words, my mind struggling to comprehend. Unbind. What did that even mean? Did they simply fall from their frames? No, the terror in his words suggested something far more insidious, something metaphysical, something alive. Alaric wrote of an ancient, forgotten ritual, a form of active containment passed down through generations of secluded monastic orders, later absorbed and suppressed by the Vatican. It wasn't just about locking things away. It was about presence, about conscious observation. The witness was not merely a guard, but an anchor, a living tether keeping the painted horrors bound to their canvases. He spoke of the gaze, visio obscura, the act of seeing them, truly seeing them as a form of spell, a constant reaffirmation of their imprisonment. Without it, he theorized, the entities depicted within the art would regain their autonomy, their dreadful primordial sentience. They would unfurl into this reality, he wrote, consuming all that is. His subsequent entries detailed his own descent into paranoia. He became the current witness. He began to see things in the paintings, subtle shifts in expression, eyes that followed him as he moved, brushstrokes that seemed to ripple with a terrible hidden energy. He tried to rationalize it, to blame exhaustion, the isolation, the dim light. I thought I was imagining it, he confessed in one entry, until the whispers began. Whispers from the pigment, he claimed, faint at first, then growing louder, coiling around his thoughts, promising freedom, promising power, promising release from the burden. He wrote of the struggle to maintain his sanity, the constant battle to keep his gaze steady, his mind unclouded, lest he inadvertently aid in their liberation. He sought ancient texts, a codex obscura rumored to be within the Vatican's secret archives, desperate for a way to break the cycle, to find a replacement, to escape. The journal abruptly ended. The final page was unlike the others. It wasn't Alaric's usual meticulous script, but a frantic, desperate scrawl. His name, Alaric Thorne, was written large and clear at the top, but then it was viciously, savagely crossed out, not with ink, but with a substance that, even dried and ancient, still retained the sickening hue of crimson. It was blood unmistakable. Below it, a single, horrifying addendum, barely legible. They know I tried to leave. They know I looked for a successor. Purge, ademptor, go forth, taken away, removed. The finality of those two Latin words struck me with the force of a physical blow. If he was once chosen, if he was the witness, where was he now? The truth crashed down on me with the weight of a collapsing tomb. I had read it. I had known. The knowledge, once an intellectual curiosity, was now a searing brand on my soul. I was in the gallery. I was aware. The midnight hour, a concept once distant and benign, now loomed like a personal executioner. My gaze darted to the windows, already pitch black. The paintings, these beautiful, terrifying works of art, were no longer inert. They were waiting. They were watching. I was watching them. And by merely understanding Alaric's plight, by comprehending the rule, I had inadvertently entangled myself in its terrible mechanism. I had become the unwilling, unwitting heir to his cursed post. I was the new witness. The paintings, I suddenly realized, had not just unbound Alaric, they had removed him to make way for a new, unsuspecting observer. Me. My breathing grew shallow, ragged. The air, already cold, turned glacial. Every shadow in the room seemed to lengthen, to deepen, to take on impossible forms. The faces in the canvases, once merely painted expressions, now seemed to possess a terrible, nascent sentience. A woman in a dark portrait, her eyes once vacant, now seemed to hold a flicker of something ancient, something that recognized me, acknowledged my trespass. A landscape, previously serene, now hinted at impossible depths, dark, roiling clouds obscuring something vast and hungry. I clutched the journal, its pages now feeling less like parchment and more like flayed skin, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I should have stopped. I should have turned back. I should have never opened that drawer. But I kept reading, and now I knew, and the knowing was an irreversible poison. Now, as the hour hand creeps ever closer to the zenith of its nightly journey, I feel their patience thinning, their hunger rising, a slow, insatiable tide of silent malevolence. I know what happens if I look away. I know what happens if I leave. I cannot leave. The chill that now permanently clings to my bones feels less like the Vatican's ancient stone and more like a shroud, woven from secrets and despair. I replay that encounter with Cardinal Vincenzo in my mind 1,000 times, each time hopping for a different outcome, a different path. But there isn't one. The moment his gaze, sharp and desperate, pinned me against the cold wall near the sealed stairwell, my fate was already etched. I was merely wandering, or so I told myself, drawn by an inexplicable hum that resonated from behind the ancient, bolted door. A sound like distant, sibilant whispers, always just at the edge of hearing, always promising revelation. He appeared from the shadows, a spectral figure draped in scarlet, his face pale as plaster, stark against the deep crimson of his cassock. His hands, usually so steady when holding the chalice, trembled violently, clutching at the gilded cross upon his chest, as if warding off an unseen assailant. He didn't raise his voice, merely whispered, his words a dry, rasping breath in the echoing corridor. "You are marked," he hissed, his eyes wide with a terror I now understand all too well. "The paintings. They remember. Once you see them bleed, they see you forever." His gaze flickered towards the ornate frames that lined the corridor, their subjects, saints and martyrs, seeming to shift beneath the ancient varnish. He was speaking of the fleeting, nightmarish visions I'd dismissed as fatigue, as tricks of light, as the strain of endless research in the archives. I had seen something in those canvases, a flicker of raw, red vitality beneath the pigments, a fleeting glimpse of something alive and in agony, something I immediately pushed from my mind as impossible. But the Cardinal's words gave shape to the impossible, confirming it, cementing it into the fabric of my reality. He begged me not to return, not to seek whatever lay behind that sealed door. His voice broke on the words, a man on the precipice of utter collapse. "Flee, child," he pleaded, his hand reaching out, then retracting as if fearful of contamination. "Forget what you think you saw. Forget what you think you heard. Walk away before it is too late." But he never said what too late truly meant, what would happen if I disobeyed. He spoke of the paintings remembering of their endless gaze, but offered no specific horror, no concrete consequence. Perhaps that was the true genius of his warning, or perhaps its greatest flaw. The ambiguity left a void, and my academic curiosity, my insatiable need to understand, rushed in to fill it. I went back anyway, of course. How could I not? The forbidden has always been the most potent lure for minds like mine, minds that chafe at the edges of accepted knowledge, forever seeking the crack in the facade. The sealed stairwell, now with its ominous warning echoing in my ears, became an irresistible enigma. I knew, with a certainty that bordered on madness, that whatever lay beyond that door held the key to the bleeding paintings, to the Cardinal's terror, and perhaps to the very heart of the Vatican's most carefully guarded secrets. It took days, then weeks, of clandestine observation, of deciphering obscure architectural schematics from the deepest layers of the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum to find the hidden mechanism. A series of seemingly innocuous pressure plates beneath a mosaic, a forgotten key in a long-abandoned custodian's office. The labyrinthine obfuscation was a testament to the dread it was meant to contain. One night, under the pretense of late-night research, I slipped past the Swiss Guard patrols, my heart thudding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and finally, with a soft click and the groan of ancient stone, the door swung inward. The air that greeted me was thick, heavy with the scent of dust, parchment, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like ancient blood. The stairwell spiraled downwards into impenetrable darkness, steeper and narrower than any public passage in the Holy See. I descended, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating crumbling frescoes that depicted grotesque, winged figures, not angels, but something far older, far more terrible, their eyes seeming to follow my every move. Below, I found not a catacomb, but a chamber, a vast, echoing space lined with shelves upon shelves of codices, scrolls, and forbidden texts, all bound in dark, unmarked leather or sealed with wax bearing cryptic, non-papal sigils. This was not merely a secret archive. This was a prison for knowledge deemed too dangerous to exist, a repository of heresies and truths too potent for mortal minds. My academic detachment, usually my shield against the more unsettling aspects of my research, began to fray almost immediately. The sheer volume of forbidden lore was staggering. I started with a grimoire bound in what felt suspiciously like human skin, its pages filled with elegant, maddeningly intricate script in a mixture of forgotten Latin dialects and a language I couldn't even identify. It spoke of entities, not divine or demonic as conventionally understood, but something different, something older. The language was full of esoteric terminology describing rituals of obfuscation, of spiritual binding, and of something called ocular transference, a method by which certain watchers could project their consciousness into fixed objects, like frescoes or tapestries, and observe the mortal plane. This explained the cardinal's warning about the paintings, about their memory, about their seeing. I felt a cold dread begin to seep into my bones, a premonition of irreversible trespass. I should have stopped when I read the passage describing the vermilion veil, a thin membrane between our world and theirs, made permeable by certain acts of observation, when the viewer truly sees the bleed, not just pigment, but essence. It warned that such an act creates an indelible bond, a connection across the veil that cannot be broken. Once the eye has seen the sanguine truth, the text proclaimed in chillingly stark Latin, oculus cognoscit veritatem sanguinis, the spirit is irrevocably marked, a beacon in the perpetual night. I thought I was imagining it until the shadows in the chamber began to deepen and coalesce, taking on vague, fleeting forms at the very periphery of my vision. Whispers, no longer distant or sibilant, seemed to brush against my ears, indistinct but undeniably present, like dry leaves rustling in a mausoleum. But I kept reading, driven by a perverse need to connect the fragments, to understand the mechanism of my own doom. I discovered references to an ancient, pre-Christian cult, not of devil worshippers, but of something far more insidious, a brotherhood dedicated to cultivating specific thresholds, where the veil was thinnest, where the bleed was most likely to occur. They called these points chambers of scrutiny, and the Vatican, I now realized with a sickening lurch, was built atop one of the most potent. The paintings throughout the basilica, the frescoes in the corridors, they weren't just art. They were conduits, carefully positioned eyes, watching for the moment a curious soul might pierce the illusion. The cardinal's dread-filled plea, his absolute conviction that I was marked, now made horrifying, absolute sense. I hadn't just seen them bleed, I had activated them. The texts detailed specific names, not personal appellations, but vibrational keys, frequencies of being that could, if pronounced or even merely known with sufficient intent, draw the attention of these entities from beyond the veil. I stumbled upon one such name, written in a cramped, almost panicked hand on a loose vellum sheet tucked within a crumbling folio. It wasn't a word I could easily articulate, more a sequence of guttural sounds and sharp clicks, but merely seeing it, letting my mind attempt to form it, felt like a breach. A sudden, oppressive silence descended upon the chamber, heavier than the dust, more suffocating than the ancient air. The shadows around me ceased to merely coalesce. They solidified, gaining density, their edges blurring into the outlines of non-Euclidean geometry, pressing in from all sides. A profound cold, not of stone or air, but of pure malevolence, enveloped me. I was no longer merely reading about being marked. I was experiencing it. The silence stretched, waiting, listening. I felt their gaze, not through the paintings in the upper levels, but directly, intimately, from within the very fabric of the chamber. I had not merely disobeyed the cardinal. I had thrown open the door he had begged me to keep shut. Now, as I sit in my study, the faint light of the Roman dawn filtering through the window, I know the meaning of too late. The knowledge itself is the curse. The names I've seen, the rituals I've glimpsed, the truth of the bleeding paintings and the entities behind them, they are indelible. They are a part of me now, and I a part of their vast, ancient observation. They are watching, always, and they are very, very patient. The quiet hum in my head, a constant companion since the discovery of the Codex Obscurum, grows louder with each passing day, each stolen hour spent deciphering its forbidden script. It isn't just the words anymore. It's the implications, the gnawing dread that settles deep in the marrow of my bones, a cold certainty that I have stumbled across something irreversible. My research, once a beacon of intellectual curiosity, now feels like a plummet into an abyss of esoteric horror, each revelation a stone tied to my ankle, dragging me further down. The warnings, dismissed as metaphor or the fevered ramblings of monastic recluses, now resonate with a chilling prescience. Ni revelata quod celata, they wrote. Let not that which is hidden be revealed. But I did reveal it. I tore back the veil, and now I understand that some knowledge is not meant to be known, not by mortal minds, for it rends the fabric of reality itself. My sleep has become a mosaic of half-remembered nightmares, figures in shrouds whispering names I dare not repeat even to myself, names that feel like ancient keys turning in rusted locks, threatening to unbind something immense and terrible. The lines between what is real and what is born of sleepless delirium blur, a constant, disorienting haze. I see shadows where there should be none, hear phantom echoes in the dead of night, and my own reflection sometimes seems to hold an alien glint, a premonition of some profound change already taking root within me. This obsessive pursuit of truths concealed by the Vatican for centuries, the true nature of certain forgotten saints, the ritualistic origins of relics, the existence of entities whispered only in redacted papal bulls, has transformed me, twisted my once sharp intellect into a tool for my own slow unraveling. Despite the growing unease, an inexplicable compulsion drew me back to the gallery, not the grand, sunlit halls teeming with tourists, but a forgotten, rarely opened annex, tucked away behind a service entrance in a lesser-known museum. It's a place heavy with the scent of dust, varnish, and something else, something almost metallic, like dried blood or ancient rust. I've been researching the iconography of certain early Christian martyrs displayed there, tracing their depictions back to obscure Gnostic traditions that hint at a more sinister narrative than the Church would ever openly admit. The annex is usually locked, but lately, a hidden side door I discovered remains unlocked, almost inviting me in, a silent accomplice to my clandestine investigations. The air inside was stagnant, cold, even more so than usual. My flashlight, a slender beam against the cavernous gloom, cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the familiar faces of suffering saints, their agonized expressions frozen in time. I walked the familiar circuit, my footsteps echoing unnervingly on the polished stone floor. I knew this space intimately, every cracked canvas, every chipped frame, every plinth upon which some fragmented relic rested. That's why the immediate, visceral sense of something being profoundly wrong struck me with such force. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a physical sensation, like a cold hand brushing the nape of my neck. Between two enormous, dark-hued depictions of St. Sebastian and St. Agnes, martyred in agonies of arrows and flame, there hung a new canvas. My breath caught in my throat. It shouldn't have been there. I had walked this very path less than 12 hours prior, during my last illicit visit, and that section of the wall was empty, save for the faded floral wallpaper. Now, occupying the space where only dust motes typically danced in the faint light filtering from above, was a framed painting, shrouded in shadow. Its presence was an abrupt, jarring intrusion into the established order of the room, a screaming anomaly in the otherwise immutable silence. I approached cautiously, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The canvas was large, nearly life-sized, but its subject was almost entirely consumed by a pervasive darkness. It depicted a solitary figure, cloaked in heavy, formless robes, standing against a backdrop of indistinct gloom. Only the face, pale and unsettlingly luminous, was visible. Even from a distance, the eyes held me deep, shadowed pools that seemed to draw in the sparse light, reflecting nothing but an endless void. There was something about them, something in their shape, their set, their peculiar intensity that pricked at the edges of my memory, a recognition too fleeting to grasp, yet too insistent to ignore. Quis ease? I thought, my mind demanding an answer. Who are you? My hand, trembling slightly, reached for the antique silver candelabrum I always carry during these nocturnal excursions. An anachronistic affectation, perhaps, but the flickering flame feels more authentic than cold LED light, and its warmth offers a strange comfort. As I raised it, the dancing light caressed the canvas, chasing away the clinging shadows, and the recognition, previously a vague whisper, solidified into a scream in my mind. The face. It was my face. Not a perfect mirror image, but unmistakably mine, rendered with a horrifying fidelity that transcended mere portraiture. The same sharp jawline, the same subtle curve of the nose, the intensity in the eyes that now reflected not curiosity, but an unbearable torment. But it was the mouth that truly stole my breath, freezing it in my lungs. My mouth, depicted on the canvas, was sewn shut. Thick black thread, stark against the pale skin, crisscrossed over my lips, pulling them taut into a grotesque, rictus-like grin of enforced silence. Each stitch was rendered with an almost surgical precision, terrifyingly real, as if the canvas itself had been subjected to this horrifying act. The horror was not merely in the depiction, but in the immediacy of it. The oils were vibrant, the colors rich, the texture almost wet beneath the candlelight. Every brushstroke felt fresh, as if the painting had been completed that very hour, the pigments still emanating the faint, earthy scent of a studio, incongruous in this ancient space. How could this be? How could a painting of me, a painting of my future, my silenced future, appear here overnight, in a place I know so intimately? The Vatican texts, the ones I had painstakingly translated from forgotten dialects of Coptic and Syriac, spoke of a certain kind of previsionary art, art not created by human hands, but manifested by the convergence of specific esoteric energies, often triggered by the uncovering of forbidden knowledge. They called them imagines fati, images of fate, and warned that they were not mere prophecies, but direct, physical conduits of an inescapable destiny, created when one transgressed beyond the threshold of allowable human understanding. The act of knowing in itself becomes the brushstroke. I should have stopped, I whispered, the words catching in my own throat, a cruel irony given the canvas before me. I should have stopped when I found the passage about the custard silentae, the guardians of silence, an ancient order dedicated not to protecting knowledge, but to erasing it and those who dared to seek it. Their methods, hinted at in the most redacted appendices, were not of assassination, but of fundamental unmaking, of ensuring that an individual's existence, once deemed dangerous, was not just ended, but never was. This painting felt like their grim announcement, a signature on my death warrant, yet so much more insidious. The stitched mouth. It screams of the secrets I have learned, the words I now possess, the names that summon. It is a terrifying promise of the silence that awaits me, a silence born not of my choosing, but enforced. The dark threads are the cost of my relentless pursuit, the price of understanding the blasphemous truth behind the cult of the Veiled Mother or the true lineage of the Serpent Saints. These shadowy rituals, once academic curiosities, now feel like tangible, looming threats, encircling me, tightening their grip. The gallery, usually a sanctuary of historical inquiry, transformed in that moment into a personal tomb, and I, the lone mourner, staring at my own effigy. My mind raced, reeling, trying to find a logical explanation. A prank, an elaborate trap, but the freshness of the paint, the undeniable shift in the gallery's fabric, defied any rational argument. This was not human art. This was a consequence, a manifestation from the deeper currents of reality I had unwittingly disturbed. The eyes in the painting, my eyes, seemed to bore into me, reflecting back not just my fear, but a deeper, more profound terror, one that hadn't yet fully bloomed in my own living face. It was the terror of understanding that I am already gone, in a sense. My future has been painted, my silence codified, and this canvas is merely the physical receipt. I felt a cold dread seeping into every fiber of my being, a certainty that the forces I had so foolishly sought to understand were now fully aware of me. The painting wasn't just a portrait. It was a connection, a tether, a ritual artifact that had somehow drawn my very essence from the future to mark my present. The darkness in the painting seemed to deepen, to coil and writhe around the cloaked figure, threatening to consume even the faint light of my candelabrum. I could almost hear the whisper of ancient incantations, the rustle of robes in forgotten crypts, the turning of pages in forbidden grimoires. I was no longer merely observing, I was observed. Every breath I draw now tastes of grave dust and linseed oil. The chill in this cell, if one can even call it that, is a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the dread that clings to my very bones. I remember the day, or perhaps the night, when the audacity finally overtook the terror. It was not courage, no, not a flicker of anything so noble. It was the absolute, crushing certainty that living with it another moment was a fate far worse than whatever final damnation burning the canvas might bring. I had pored over the forbidden texts for weeks, my eyes red-rimmed, my mind a churning abyss of arcane symbols and whispered warnings. The Libellus Tenebrarum, a tome I had only ever glimpsed in encrypted Vatican archives, spoke of entities bound to effigies, of spirit traps crafted with such malevolent precision that their very existence warped the fabric of reality around them. It offered no direct counsel on destruction, merely containment, a horrifying perpetual maintenance. But I, in my naive hubris, believed I could find a loophole, a hidden incantation, a forgotten method of unmaking. I thought I was smarter than centuries of cloistered terror. I was wrong. My research had consumed me, blurring the lines between waking and nightmare. I saw its shadow in the corner of my eye, felt its oppressive gaze even when I had covered it, barricaded it, turned its face to the wall. The painting, a grotesque parody of Baroque portraiture, was not merely a piece of art. It was a hungry aperture, a window into a place that should never be gazed upon, a place from which something had already reached out to claim a piece of me. The details of its capture, its eventual placement in this institution, remain shrouded in the kind of institutional secrecy that implies unspeakable horrors, things the Church itself is too afraid to acknowledge openly. But the whispers among the cloistered historians, the frantic cross-references in the restricted section of the Laurentian library, painted a chilling picture of an entity too powerful to be truly destroyed, only ever to be contained. And that containment, I now understand, required living sacrifices not of blood but of sanity, of truth, of self. My plan, born of desperation, and the lingering scent of wood smoke from the guard's hearth, was crude but direct. Fire. Pure, cleansing fire. If the text spoke of its containment through ritualistic wards, perhaps the removal of its physical anchor would free the world, if not me, from its influence. I stole a torch from the guard's common room, a heavy, wrought-iron contraption used for nocturnal rounds. The weight of it in my hand was not reassuring. It felt like holding a scepter of inevitable doom. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the echoing corridors. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, ready to coalesce into the very monstrosity I intended to confront. I remember the profound, almost spiritual stillness of the chamber when I re-entered. The painting hung as always, perfectly centered on the far wall, a beacon of malevolence in the dim light filtering through the high, barred window. Even covered, draped in heavy black velvet, I could feel its presence, a cold, hungry hum in the air. I should have stopped then, when the sheer wrongness of the room pressed in on me like a physical weight, telling me this was a boundary I was never meant to cross. But the alternative, succumbing to its insidious influence, was no longer an option. I had to try. I had to. With trembling hands, I tore away the velvet shroud. The sight of it, even after all this time, still steals the breath from my lungs. The figure in the portrait is both familiar and utterly alien. It looks vaguely human, or at least a cruel mockery of it. A gaunt, elongated face, eyes like bottomless pits reflecting not light, but an inner void. The colors are sickeningly vibrant, almost pulsing, as if the artist had painted with something other than pigment. It was an obscenity, a blasphemy made manifest on canvas. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the reality of the room, drawing all light and warmth into its abyssal depths. I raised the torch, its meager flame sputtering in the suffocating aura of the chamber. My hand shook, but my resolve, forged in the fires of madness and desperation, held firm. Per dam te abominationem, I whispered, a desperate, half-remembered fragment from a ritual of banishment, utterly inadequate, utterly meaningless against what I faced. The Latin felt hollow on my tongue, a childish incantation against a cosmic horror. I thrust the torch forward, the flickering flame licking at the bottom edge of the canvas. The smell that immediately filled the room was not the sweet char of burning linen or oil paint. No, it was something far more ancient, far more visceral, the stench of scorched bone, of old blood, of something impossibly ancient and alive being peeled back layer by agonizing layer. The canvas didn't catch fire, not in the way ordinary materials do. Instead, the paint itself seemed to recoil, to writhe and undulate like living flesh. The colors bled into one another, swirling like a dying galaxy, and the figure within the portrait began to twist, its painted limbs contorting with impossible fluidity. Its head tilted, slowly, unnervingly, as if regarding me with dawning recognition. The eyes, those dreadful, lightless pits, seemed to bore directly into my soul, not just seeing me, but knowing me, identifying me as the source of its pain. A low, guttural sound began to emanate from the canvas, a sound that wasn't quite a crackle, not quite a hiss, but something deeper, more resonant, vibrating in my teeth. It was the sound of something primordial stirring, awakening to a desecration. Then its mouth, a jagged, painted line, split open. Not a crack in the pigment, not a tear in the canvas, but a sickening, organic widening, revealing a black, cavernous void within. And from that void, a sound erupted that curdled my blood and shattered my sanity into 1,000 irreparable shards. It was a scream, a full, agonizing, ear-splitting shriek of pure torment and rage. But it wasn't the scream of a demon or a beast or even a painting. It was my scream. My own voice, twisted and distorted, amplified to an unbearable pitch, echoing back at me from the depths of that painted maw. It knew my voice. It possessed it. It had taken a piece of me, and now it flung it back, a weapon, a testament to its dominion. The sound tore through the chamber, vibrating the very stone, rattling the bars on the window. It was the sound of every fear I had ever harbored, every regret, every unspoken dread, woven into a symphony of absolute horror. I dropped the torch, the heat forgotten, my hands flying to my ears in a desperate, futile attempt to shut out the sonic assault. My scream echoed from the painting, and from my own throat, in a horrifying, synchronous chorus. The sudden, violent crash of the chamber doors being thrown open felt almost secondary to the screeching agony emanating from the canvas. Guards, heavily armed, clad in the sombre robes of the order, their faces grim, their movements precise. They didn't look at me, sprawled on the floor, weeping, screaming. Their eyes were fixed on the painting, on the writhing, screaming figure. They moved not to my aid, not to contain me, but to it. Two of them immediately positioned themselves in front of the canvas, their bodies forming a shield, their hands gripping their ceremonial staves, as if preparing for battle. Others swept through the room, dousing the dropped torch, extinguishing the lingering embers that had barely touched the cursed thing. Their actions were a sudden, chilling clarity amidst my fractured reality. They were not protecting me from the monstrosity I had tried to destroy. They were protecting the monstrosity from me. They were protecting the prison more than the prisoner. I was merely an inmate, a nuisance, perhaps even bait. The painting, this vile, living portal, was something far more important to them, something to be guarded, perhaps even revered, at all costs. It was then, as they stared at me with cold, unforgiving eyes, that I understood the true depth of my entrapment. The Vatican, the Order, these keepers of forgotten horrors, they weren't trying to save humanity from this thing. They were merely tending their flock, maintaining their livestock. And I, in my quest for knowledge, had merely stumbled into the feeding pen. The scream eventually died down, not truly ending, but receding, withdrawing back into the canvas, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. The figure in the painting settled, its distorted features reforming, its mouth once again a flat, painted line, its eyes, those terrible, knowing eyes, fixed on me. And I knew with a certainty that eclipsed all other understanding that it remembered my voice. It owned it, and it would never let me forget. I tried to destroy it, and it screamed my name, and they came to protect it from me. What does that make me, if not another sacrifice on an altar I can never escape? The taste of varnish. It clings to my tongue when I wake, a phantom film that no amount of water can quite rinse away. It's the bitter, resinous tang of oil paint, of aged wood, of something sealed and preserved for centuries. I sit up in bed, sometimes gasping, sometimes simply staring into the pre-dawn gloom, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. My breath catches, not from fright, but from a profound sense of displacement, as if I've just been forcibly ejected from somewhere I wasn't meant to be, leaving a part of me still tethered, still lingering. I should have stopped when the dreams first began, when the figures in the ecclesiastical paintings I'd been studying began to stir in my subconscious. I should have recognized the subtle shift from scholarly fascination to something far more insidious. But I kept reading, kept delving deeper into the restricted Vatican archives, pulling at threads that warned of being left alone, texts marked with seals and warnings of non-licit, forbidden even to the most dedicated of scholars. My curiosity, once a beacon, has become a brand, scarring me from the inside out. The initial dreams were abstract, a kaleidoscope of sepia tones and muted golds, a cacophony of hushed whispers that were just beyond my comprehension. I dismissed them, at first, as the natural consequence of immersion in my work, the subconscious processing of countless hours spent poring over ancient manuscripts and illuminated folios. But then, the whispers began to coalesce, to form words, phrases, and then full, terrifying verses. They were not in any language I consciously knew, yet when I woke, the syllables would echo in my mind, sometimes so powerfully that I'd find myself muttering them aloud, a strange, guttural chant slipping from my lips before my conscious mind could clamp down on it. It started with fragments, a distorted miserere may hear, a guttural invocation there, twisting the familiar into something blasphemous. I would jolt awake, convinced I could still hear the brushstrokes scraping against canvas, the faint, dry rustle of ancient robes, and the low, resonant murmur of voices I couldn't place. The first time I found a line of what looked like archaic Latin scrawled on my bedside pad, a pad I always kept for sudden inspirations, but never for automatic writing, my blood ran cold. De mihi animam, ut in luce fiam. Give me the soul, that I may become light. I had no memory of writing it, yet my own distinct, hurried script stared back at me accusing. This wasn't just my imagination. This was an intrusion. The more I researched the peculiar iconographies, the forgotten hagiographies, and the whispered apocrypha surrounding certain miraculous and unaccountably active canvases mentioned in various obscure texts, some of them only hinted at in the Codex Gigas's Marginalia, others detailed in the infamous Liber Vaci, whose authenticity I had always doubted until now, the more vivid and demanding my dreams became. I was no longer merely a viewer. I was being drawn into a conversation I hadn't realized was already underway. The saints, the virgins, the martyrs, they were no longer static images. In my dreams, their eyes followed me, their painted lips moved, not always in prayer, but often in invitation. Their gestures, once frozen in devotional tableau, became fluid, beckoning. Sometimes it was Saint Sebastian, his wounds weeping iridescent light, his hand extended, not in suffering, but in a peculiar, almost knowing welcome. Other times, it was the Madonna, her face no longer serene, but etched with an ancient, unbearable sorrow, her gaze pulling me into the infinite depth of her painted world. They wanted me to step closer, to cross the threshold of the frame. And each time, I felt my soul lean forward, an unbearable magnetic pull, a response that was instinctive, terrifyingly primal. I tried to fight it. I tried to burn incense, to recite prayers, to place crucifixes around my bed. Foolish, superstitious acts for a scholar who prided himself on rational thought. But rationality had deserted me the moment I recognized the sigils in my dream texts from the forgotten rituals described in a fragmentary manuscript I found deep within the Vatican Apostolic Library's most restricted section, labeled Adversus Haereses, De Picturis Animarum. It described how certain masters long ago imbued their works with a living essence, not through simple artistic genius, but through hidden, esoteric means, binding spiritual entities or fragments of souls within the pigment, meant to guide or protect, or perhaps to feed. A terrifying form of spiritual alchemy, veiled as sacred art. The knowledge was a contagion, festering in my mind, confirming the dread reality of my dreams. The whispers evolved. They became specific instructions, not just abstract chants. They spoke of forgotten names, names that, according to the texts, could not only summon, but could also bind, or even replace. Nomina sunt numina, the dream voices echoed. Names are numinous powers. They listed these names, not in Latin, but in a language that felt older than recorded history, a series of guttural clicks and elongated vowels that resonated deep within my bone marrow. I would wake, my throat hoarse, convinced I had been repeating them for hours. My research now felt like a curse, confirming the reality of the dream texts. Every obscure reference to a living icon or a speaking canvas I dismissed as poetic license now screamed its truth. The psychological toll is immense. I am constantly exhausted, my waking hours a grey prelude to the vibrant, terrifying reality of my sleep. My reflection in the mirror is growing unfamiliar, my eyes wide and bloodshot, my skin sallow, as if some vital essence is being slowly leached from me. I feel thinner, more translucent, as though the boundaries of my own flesh are becoming porous, allowing something to seep in or out. The taste of varnish is a constant reminder that the barrier is weakening. I see the world through a fine, almost imperceptible film, as if reality itself is becoming a painted canvas, its colors slightly off, its textures unnervingly flat. Last night, the invitation was almost irresistible. It wasn't just a general beckoning. It was a specific figure, a lesser-known St. Jude from a small, early Renaissance piece I had studied weeks ago. He extended his hand, not beckoning with his fingers, but offering his entire forearm, and I saw through his translucent skin into the swirling, shimmering void within the canvas. I felt my spirit physically shift, straining against the confines of my own body, a profound yearning to step across that painted plane. There was a moment, a terrifying, ecstatic fraction of a second, where I was both here and there, my consciousness stretched thin, a membrane between worlds. I felt the cool, dry air of the painted dimension, heard the rustle of painted fabric, and smelled the faint, sweet scent of something ancient and terrible. I pulled back at the last possible moment, or perhaps something held me back, but not before I felt the distinct sensation of a small piece of me, a sliver of my very awareness, snap off and remain behind, adhering to the gilded frame. I know now that the Vatican archives I plundered were not merely collections of historical documents. They were an intricate tapestry of warnings, of forgotten sciences, of dangerous truths locked away for millennia, not to protect us from the knowledge, but to protect the knowledge from us, or perhaps to protect them from us. And I, in my arrogant pursuit of what I thought was enlightenment, have stumbled upon the very mechanism of their escape, inadvertently turning the key. I have not only learned their names, but I have also, unknowingly, answered their calls. And if I already answer their voices, how much of me is left outside, truly? I am becoming a part of their canvas, a new detail in their eternal, terrifying tableau. The decision to leave Rome was not made with the swift, decisive clarity I often project in my professional life. It was an act of raw, desperate flight. The air in the city had grown thick with unspoken dread, the shadows under ancient arches seeming to writhe with unholy purpose. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw not the familiar patterns of my eyelids, but the intricate, unsettling geometries detailed in the forbidden texts I had unearthed from the Vatican's most guarded archives, texts that spoke of entities not bound by earthly logic, of rituals that fractured the very fabric of perception. I packed nothing but a small bag, my mind reeling, the heavy leather of the Codex Obscura still ghosting against my fingertips, its pages smelling of sulfur and dust. I told myself that distance, a physical severing from the source of my infection, would be a cure. I boarded the train at Termini, clutching my ticket like a lifeline, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a desperate prayer for normalcy. For the first hour, there was a tentative sense of relief. The rolling Tuscan landscape, bathed in the soft afternoon light, offered a balm to my frayed nerves. I watched vineyards blur past, villages perched precariously on hilltops, their ancient stones radiating a history I now found profoundly unsettling. I leaned back, my eyes heavy, hoping for sleep, for a cessation of the constant, humming fear that had become my companion. I should have known better, of course. I should have recognized that the very act of knowing, of peering into the sacred abysses described within those Vatican-held manuscripts, had irrevocably altered me. The words, the forbidden names, the diagrams of transdimensional summoning that the Liber Noctis so clinically detailed, they weren't merely information. They were incantations, spells cast upon the reader. It began subtly, as all truly insidious horrors do. As the train pulled into a brief stop at a nameless station, my gaze drifted to a faded poster tacked to a support pillar on the platform opposite. It was an advertisement for some local art exhibition, a reproduction of a Renaissance painting, perhaps. My breath hitched. The subject, a rather unassuming depiction of Saint Sebastian, his body pierced by arrows, his gaze turned heavenward, seemed familiar. Too familiar. The precise curve of his lips, the almost beatific agony in his eyes, the subtle bleed of his wounds. I had seen it before, not in a museum, but within the pages of the Ars Demoniaca, illustrating a section on suffering as conduit. I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of the light, the subconscious churning through recent memories. But even as the train lurched forward, pulling away from the station, the image lingered, seared behind my eyelids, the saint's eyes now seeming to follow me. The journey continued, and so did the disquieting apparitions. In another station, a billboard for a local bank, depicting a serene, almost angelic woman, seemed to ripple and shift. For a sickening moment, her features sharpened, her hair becoming a cascade of impossible light, her hands clasped in prayer, but her eyes were not those of a tranquil figure. They were the eyes of Saint Catherine of Siena, as depicted in a particular woodcut from the Speculum Trinitatis, illustrating her ecstatic visions, visions that often involved grotesque visitations and profound spiritual torment. Her painted tears, I swear, shimmered with a wet, crimson sheen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drum against an encroaching reality. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, trying to anchor myself in the tangible world outside. But the world was beginning to betray me. The reflections in the train window became my primary tormentors. The passing landscape, superimposed with the interior of the carriage, created a canvas for the unseen artist. In the distorted glass, faces would coalesce from the play of light and shadow, familiar faces, agonizingly so. Saint Bartholomew, flayed alive, his skin draped over his arm like a cloak, his gaze a silent scream. Saint Lawrence, bound to the gridiron, his face etched with a strange, defiant peace, yet his eyes burning with an almost feral intensity. Their suffering was palpable, their presence accusatory. They stared at me, their painted eyes holding the weight of centuries of dogma, of faith twisted into a tool, of knowledge concealed and weaponized. These weren't mere images. They were, I was beginning to realize, echoes of the idola described in the Libro dell'Ombra, the residual psychic imprints left by profound suffering, invoked by specific sequences of sigils and whispered names. I should have stopped when the first vague suspicion formed that the gallery wasn't merely following me, but was actively being projected onto my reality. But I kept watching, morbidly compelled, unable to tear my gaze away from the glass. The more I looked, the more distinct they became, the more numerous. Every reflective surface, every blank space that my mind might unconsciously fill, became a portal. The polished wood paneling of the train compartment, the steel gleam of a passing industrial park, even the blank screen of a fellow passenger's phone, all momentarily became a canvas for bleeding saints, their eyes wide with eternal witness, their painted mouths perhaps silently mouthing the names I had read, the names that should never be spoken aloud. The air grew cold, not with any physical chill, but with the profound, existential dread of absolute solitude within a throng. The dreadful truth solidified its grip on my mind with the certainty of a fever dream. This was no ordinary hallucination. This was not the result of exhaustion or stress. This was an active, malevolent manifestation, a consequence of my illicit research. The gallery, those horrific images, they were not external entities chasing me across Italy. They were the physical manifestation of the knowledge I had consumed, the forbidden truths I had uncovered within the Vatican's hidden chambers. Those ancient books, guarded for centuries, were not merely repositories of information. They were conduits, their words imbued with a subtle, insidious power designed to open the reader's perception to a reality that was never meant for human eyes. Soli electi vident, one inscription had chillingly declared, only the chosen see. And I, a fool, had chosen to see. The more I tried to deny it, the more aggressive the visions became. I tried to focus on the rhythmic clickety-clack of the train, on the mundane chatter of other passengers, on the fleeting glimpses of olive groves and cypress trees. But the saints were always there, just at the periphery, in the corner of my eye, their agonized expressions twisting into something more predatory, more knowing. Their eyes were not just witnessing my fear, they were feeding on it, growing brighter, more vivid, their painted wounds seeming to weep fresh, crimson tears. I remembered a particularly obscure passage from the Rituale Sacrum, detailing how certain visual stimuli, when combined with specific linguistic triggers, could create a visual nexus, a temporary bridge between our world and the Umbra Mundi, the shadow world from which these entities drew their power. I had not merely read about it, I had inadvertently activated it within myself. My blood ran cold as the full horror dawned on me. The gallery wasn't following me. It was me. Or rather, my perception had been so fundamentally and irreversibly altered by the forbidden knowledge that I could now no longer distinguish between the mundane and the monstrous. The saints, the suffering, the bleeding eyes, they were now permanently overlaid onto my reality, a filter of dread that I could not remove. The train, once a symbol of escape, became a fast-moving prison, hurtling me through a world that was now irrevocably tainted. Ad infinitum spectator, another Latin phrase from the Codex Hermetica, echoed in my mind. An eternal viewer. I was trapped, a perpetual audience to a gallery of terror, its exhibits now sourced from the depths of my own desecrated mind. There was no running from this. There was no going back. The relentless judgment from those painted eyes was crushing, a constant, silent accusation. They were the guardians of the threshold I had so foolishly crossed, the sentinels of the truth I had stolen. They knew what I knew. They saw what I now saw. And I felt with a chilling certainty that their perpetual gaze was not merely to torment, but to subtly, incrementally change me, to prepare me for something else, something far worse, that lay just beyond the veil of their painted anguish. The journey continued, each kilometer of distance a deepening plunge into an inescapable waking nightmare. I am an open book to them now, my mind laid bare, a canvas for their enduring agony and silent condemnation. I am no longer just seeing the gallery, I am becoming a part of it. And I know now, with chilling certainty, that the only escape is to stop seeing altogether. My fingers trace the parchment, the rough texture a strange comfort against the growing brittleness of my own skin. It feels like I am writing on vellum peeled from my own body, an unholy palimpsest of flesh and fear. The words aren't flowing, they are bleeding onto the page, each stroke of the pen a slow, agonizing drip of crimson ink, so thick and viscous it almost seems to clot before it dries. This isn't a metaphor, not anymore. My veins, visible beneath the translucent, cracking surface of what was once my hand, are not blue or green, but a vibrant, unnatural red, like fresh vermilion strokes across stretched linen. And the mirror, the last mirror. That was the true betrayal, the final, undeniable proof that the transformation was not merely happening to me, but through me as me. I remember staring into it not days ago, perhaps hours. Time has lost its grip, a concept as flimsy as the fading outline of my own features. Instead of my eyes, my nose, the familiar landscape of my face, there was only a churning vortex of oil paint, dark umbers and Venetian reds swirling into an impasto surface. Thick, tangible. It was a still life, not a reflection. A portrait of absence, painted into the very fabric of my being. My skin now flakes into pigment, not dead cells, but rich, vibrant dust that settles on this paper, mingling with the bleeding ink. I should have stopped. Oh, I should have stopped when I first found the binding, so crudely stitched with something that felt disturbingly like human hair. But the allure, you see, the academic's fatal flaw, the scholar's insatiable hunger for the unseen, the unrecorded, compelled me forward. It began innocently enough, a seemingly innocuous entry in a Vatican archive index, a cross-reference to a text supposedly destroyed during the sack of Rome. Liber Pictoris Animi, it read, the book of the painter of souls. A marginal note indicated its contents were unfit for human contemplation, which, of course, was an irresistible siren call to a man like me, a researcher specializing in fringe theology and apocalyptic cults of the early Renaissance. I navigated the labyrinthine catacombs of the Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana, past layers of security, through dusty, hallowed halls, until I found myself in a section marked only with a single, faded numeral, a vault that seemed to exist outside of any map, any official record. The air was thick there, heavy with the scent of aged parchment, and something else, something metallic, almost ferrous, like dried blood. The codex itself was a masterpiece of grotesque artistry. Bound in what I now suspect was sun-dried human leather, its pages were not vellum, but a strange, resilient material that felt both like skin and silk. The script was a variant of Vulgate Latin, but laced with glyphs and sigils that twisted the familiar letters into something alien, something that seemed to hum with a low, inaudible frequency. The names within. Oh, the names. Not the familiar pantheon of demons or angels, but entities from an older cosmos, pre-Abrahamic, perhaps pre-human. Names like Xylosthera, Unformer, the Weaver of Skinlight. They weren't merely names. They were invocations, each letter a brushstroke upon the canvas of reality, each syllable a thread in a tapestry of dread. I kept reading, of course. I thought I was simply translating, documenting, bringing light to shadows. I thought I was immune. The first hint of the painting's hunger came subtly. My reflection in the window of my study began to waver, not like heat haze, but like brushstrokes blurring. Then came the vivid, disturbing dreams. Not nightmares, but compositions. I would wake convinced I had just been an observer in some cosmic atelier, watching immense, unseen hands dip colossal brushes into starlight and shadows, crafting landscapes of pure terror. My sleep offered no respite, only further immersion into the aesthetics of the void. And then the peeling. Small, almost imperceptible flakes at first, from the tips of my fingers, then my forearms. I dismissed it as dry skin, a dermatological quirk brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But the flakes weren't dead cells. They were microscopic chips of color, like dried paint flecking from an ancient fresco. My veins, once hidden, began to surface, not with the delicate tracery of capillaries, but with a stark, brutal clarity like lines drawn with sanguine charcoal. They pulsed with a disturbing luminescence, an internal glow that made my skin appear almost transparent. I should have fled then, burned the book, screamed for help. But the names, the glyphs, they had already seeped into the marrow of my bones. I was becoming part of their language, a living lexicon, a walking canvas. The Vatican, I realize now, doesn't merely seal away such texts for fear of their content. They seal them away because they are active. They are not records of rituals. They are the rituals themselves, waiting for a suitable medium, a conduit, a gallery. The horror is not that I am dying, but that I am being rearranged. My dissolution is an act of creation, a slow, agonizing metamorphosis into something that fits the aesthetic of Xylosthera, the weaver of skinlight. My bones are hardening into the supports of a frame, my flesh liquefying and reconstituting into layers of oil, tempera, and gesso. My very consciousness feels stretched, pulled taut across a metaphorical stretcher bar, my memories becoming the faded underpainting beneath the new, vibrant, terrible composition. This confession, bleeding from my diminishing self, is the frame. It's the final, desperate plea for understanding, a warning or perhaps a transmission. I remember reading a passage from the Liber Pictoris Animi that spoke of the eternal gallery, a place where the consumed become the consumed artwork, where every stroke is a memory, every shade a forgotten scream. And for the gallery to live, the passage twisted in my mind, someone must always witness, for the observer completes the art, and the art, in turn, completes the observer. That line, it echoes in the increasingly empty chambers of my mind. It clarifies the terror. I am not merely being painted into the gallery. I am becoming the opening of the gallery. My transformation is the grand unveiling, and you, reader, by the act of witnessing, by consuming these bleeding words, are stepping inside. My eyes are no longer eyes, I think, but swirling pools of indigo and sepia, reflecting not light, but the dim, shifting patterns of an inner world, a world where the brushstrokes are the very fabric of existence. The air around me is thick with the scent of linseed oil and turpentine, masking the faint, metallic tang of my own dissolving essence. I can feel the edges of myself, the sharp, deliberate lines of the new composition, solidifying around my rapidly fadding core. There is no escape, no repentance, no absolution. Only the final, inevitable merging. The gallery is open, and tonight it is you who completes the scene.